what I want to finish up with in our the last third of our time together here is I want to ask about someone who is sort of in our circles, who we admire, who we've read, who we've learned from, and see what you think is either their greatest contribution to the field of ethics, philosophy, logic, government, sort of political analysis, either their best contribution or something you learned from them personally. So let's start with Robert P. Murphy, the economist. Pete, what is the most important thing you learned from the works of Bob Murphy?
Well, I'll just say an argument that I heard Bob make before I heard anyone else make. It may not be original to him, but when they started all this shutdown and everything, the lockdowns, it was like I was one of those people who was like, look, if I run over my neighbor and he can't, and he's hurt and he can't go to work, I have to make him whole. That's just logical. And I said, I don't care about future burden on your kids, because this system is falling apart faster than anything. And I said the government really needs to give people, pay every single dollar that they lost not going to work. And someone was like, well, you just want to destroy, you're not logically consistent because that will destroy the future and everything. And I said, and I came back with Bob Murphy's argument. So you're telling me if they took your house in eminent domain, you wouldn't take the check?
Exactly. That's another one where it's like, look, no one should be put in a cage for a victimless crime by the state. Now, do I advocate an increase in taxation in order to feed the people who have been caged against their will in the state prisons, or else they'll starve to death? It's like, okay, ideally they wouldn't be caged in the first place, but since they are caged, do I advocate some more taxation and more future burden on future populations in order to get them fed, because now they need the food because they've been caged by the kidnappers with badges? Reluctantly, yes. I'm sorry, I do. So yes, Pete, I of course agree with you, as well as Bob Murphy. Sal Mayweather, what is the best contribution or thing you've learned from Robert Murphy?
So, in my opinion, Bob Murphy's done such amazing stuff that it's really hard to choose from. But I think chaos theory is probably one of the most important contributions to anarchist thought in general, or just of anyone. If you read Private Production of Defense by Hoppe, he sort of proposes this challenge to future thinkers, finish this theory, right? Draw out the implications of it. And that's what Murphy does in chaos theory, and he does it beautifully. I have used his arguments, especially about private militaries, thousands of times on Twitter and online. Everybody's like, you want a private military? That's crazy. And the first thing I say to them is, well, we saw the incentive that the U.S. military had to protect Americans on 9/11. Now imagine if you were the CEO of an insurance company who had written policies on all of those skyscrapers in downtown Manhattan. Wouldn't you be more likely to make sure that there's an armada off the coast that is just waiting for some shit to happen so that you don't have to rebuild all of lower Manhattan? So, and that's just one of the many arguments that are in that book. So I recommend chaos theory to everybody, especially it's great for the more the trickier arguments, the more nuanced topics in anarchist thought.
Yeah, that is probably the book that I would second. As much as I try to be original, I'm just going to copy what Sal said. Chaos Theory was so good for me. It's one of the books where I remember where I was sitting when I read it, because it was such a red pill moment for me. It was like, people say that in the absence of a state, there might be gangs. But by the way, most gangs today are the causal result of the state creating black markets, so there'd be a lot fewer gangs. And that was like, whoa, one paragraph that was shaking me. I remember where I was sitting. And then he says, and by the way, all of these shortcomings, I'm gonna concede that they exist. And I go, oh my God, he's hurting his own argument. What a loser. And then he goes, by the way, they apply tenfold to the state. Because at least in voluntarism, you can opt out of associating with people who create a bad product. And I go, okay, The fact that I have never thought of that is so embarrassing. Thank God books are something you do alone, and this is not something I'm doing on the in front of people or on
right.
camera. Sal, you want to say something?
Just real quick, since you went up with the same one, I'm going to throw in there episode 182 of his podcast, where he goes over the rights of children. So I've been talking about this a lot on Twitter lately and defending Rothbard's ethical framework concerning children from the socialist left. And Murphy sort of hopped in on that conversation. He was like, hey, check out this episode of my podcast where I sort of, draw out the implications of this legal framework a little bit more elaborately. And that was great. I just got done listening to that. So that's 182 of the Bob Murphy Show. So I would recommend that as well.
Pete Quinones, final thoughts?
I was on a plane the first time I read Chaos Theory. I remember.
It's so funny. Yeah. It's like my grandma describing JFK getting shot. She knows exactly where she was, what she did after. It's like, yeah, I had the same idea. Thomas E. Woods Jr., PhD from Columbia and Harvard. Sal Mayweather, what is the most important contribution or thing you learned from Thomas E. Woods Jr.?
I'll tell you what. Of the top 5 influences in my entire thinking, I would probably put Tom Woods in. Geez, if he's not the top 2, man, he's the top 3. The Tom Woods Show was what, man, it took me my entire journey from Ron Paul to where I am today is because of Tom Woods. Like, I was always sort of like, I didn't want to be considered the wacky anarchist, right? Because if you're an anarchist, no one's going to take you seriously. And it was on the Tom Woods Show where he was mentioned this historian named Ralph Raico. And I was like, I like history. Let me look up Ralph Raico. And I started watching Ralph Raico lectures and reading his books. And I'm like, this guy reminds me of like my grandpa or something. Like, he's just a normal, friendly dude. And if he's an anarchist and he's this normal dude, then man, it can't be that crazy. And that's what sort of opened the door. I was like, what? Let me look at this Rothbard guy. So I mean, and not only that, but like the work that Tom Woods has done on history is just phenomenal. I think in Ralph Raico's book, Great Wars and Great Leaders, which I recommend, of course, one of the first things he says is like, hey, for future revisionist historians, you need to be looking to Tom Woods. So, I mean, there's not enough to say about Tom. My personal opinion, his greatest work is probably his podcast.
Good call. Pete Quinones, best contribution of Tom Woods.
When I first became a libertarian, I read some stuff here, some stuff there. I was reading like Ron Paul speeches, things like that. And not long afterwards, a book called Meltdown came out. And I read it twice. I mean, I just couldn't believe what they had done. I mean, how the housing crisis happened, why it happened. And I feel like getting that education in economics right off the bat really helped me a lot and, helped me become who I am now. And I met him not long after that at a Campaign for Liberty event. It's probably I probably read it like 6 months after it came out, and another 5 months, 6 months down the road, I met him and I totally fanboyed over him and everything. It was, I was just amazed to talk to him and, now to be friends with him and everything. It's just so odd, It's like, hey, I've been to that guy's house and everything. It's, it's, Tom's and Meltdown, that came into my life like right at the perfect time. And the fact I thought he was, he always makes a joke that people think he's an economist when he's really a historian and everything. He's one of the best economists on the planet. Let's not even joke, come on.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's how Dennis Prager introduced Tom on his show. And I go, you know what? I hope Tom doesn't correct him. And he didn't, because he can totally pass for it more so than, which doctors like Paul Krugman can. I got to say, Meltdown was so good. It was one of those things that it's not only the arguments are so good, on top of it, it's why haven't I heard this before? Or why does something finally make sense? It's like, well, there's greed. Well, there's kind of greed in every sector, whether it's private or public, and there's constantly always been greed. So how does the existence of greed lead to recessions? This just doesn't make any sense. And he really lays it out in that. And just as Sal said, the fact that he is, always well dressed, always so classy, has this sort of Catholic persona. I really like to think that I came to these ideas totally logically based on principles and everything. The reality is, if I didn't, meet a bunch of guys who were anarchists in suits in Scottsdale, Arizona, gosh, must have been 15 years ago almost, then I probably never would have thought twice about it. So really, it's the Tom Woodses of the world that sort of say, hey, it's okay to come here and check out our ideas. It's okay to question the foreign policy of the great governments. You don't have to be some lame pinko commie, in order to question the foreign policy establishment. Sal Mayweather, what is the most important contribution of Dave Smith?
Well, I mean, geez, his show Part of the Problem obviously reaches like a huge amount of people. Right? How many people have been turned into ANCAPs or libertarians just by what, they turn into some comedy show. Next thing you know, they're getting, radical anarcho-capitalist propaganda. So just the fact that he, to me, what Dave does that's really impressive is this, he exists as this sort of crossover medium between like the sort of Joe Rogan, Ari Shaffir crowd into like our world. And like that sort of blending, that sort of mixing really, not only does it help our image, but it also helps bring people in that are like influencers, right? And now like you have Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan show explaining Rothbardian theory to 1 million people, right? That's huge. That's enormous. So, besides for his comedy work and like all of the promotional work he does, I would say his podcast, Part of the Problem, I don't want to steal Pete's thunder here, but also that Libertas, he did like this comedy show like a couple years ago that was huge. It was like the #1 thing on iTunes in the comedy category for quite a while. So that also reached a lot of people.
Pete, best contribution to Dave Smith?
Well, really, I have two things. Him being able to go on cable news and absolutely destroy the talking heads on a panel. I mean, he goes on there and he knows more than they do. And they just go on there. What most people don't know is they tell them what they're going to talk about beforehand. So I would assume that someone like Brian Stelter, if he's on a panel with Dave, lets his people know, and his people give him 2 talking points. If they're going to talk about Syria, they get 2 talking points. Dave calls Scott Horton and says, okay, what do I need to say? And Scott goes, this, run it down like that. And then he just goes on there and he absolutely kills. And another thing, but the other thing that I learned from Dave, and this was when I think I've been listening to him since about 2016. And the only reason I found him was Malice went on the show, and I had already been following Malice, and I'm like, I want to hear what Malice has to say on this show. And then I've just been listening to Part of the Problem ever since, is how important culture is. And I think it was Dave may have been the first person I heard talk about Breitbart's quote about politics being downstream from culture. And then it made me look at politics differently. It made me realize that politicians are really just slaves of the culture, and it's whoever is making the culture, that's who they're beholden to. And in the past 10 years or so, they've been slaves of the press, academia, and now they're slaves of big tech. So I think Dave really helped me to see that.
Yeah, what I love about Smith is his ability to understand the philosophy and the reality so much that he can make the short argument on cable news. So you go to his podcast where he's going to drone on about nonsense because he's the short communication guy. But no, totally the opposite. He holds your attention the whole hour and it's over before you know it. So the fact that he's able to do both, and of course his range, as Sal mentioned, where, he can do Legion of Skanks one day, doing like these Andrew Dice Clay graphic, terrible jokes, and then talk talk about what he learned from Hans Hoppe's A Theory of Capitalism and Socialism. It's like, that is so cool. And of course, he's a father, and of course, he's married, very, good-looking, successful. He's kind to all of his guests, leftist Ben Burgess, right-wingers Nick Fuentes. I can't speak highly enough of
Dude,
Smith.
before COVID, he used to do that within the span of a couple hours. He'd like literally record live Part of the Problem at 6 p.m. in the studio, end at 7:30, go to Queens to go right to Legion of Skanks, and like then 3 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours after he had recorded Part of the Problem, he's recording Legion of Skanks. I mean, that was nuts.
Sal, are you familiar with the works of Mencius Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin?
Only through what I hear on Pete's podcast. I was introduced to both of them through Pete.
So what is the most important thing you learned from listening to Moldbug on Pete's podcast? And I'm sure you listened to my discussion with him and you just forgot to mention it. So we won't even get into that. Let's just go into what you think are Moldbug's greatest contributions.
Oh, man. Why doesn't Pete? How about Pete goes first? This way I can refresh my memory a little bit.
Sure.
Pete, best contribution of Curtis Yarvin.
The Machiavellians, I mean, bringing Burnham to the forefront. And I mean, that book is just one of the most remarkable political theory books I've ever read. I mean, it really changed my mind on a lot of things. It had me reading that book had me questioning basically everything that I had learned in libertarianism. And I think it made me stronger. Also, when he talks about the left, and him talking about basically, I think that Jeff Deist has picked up on this, and he said it a lot recently, is that the left knows how to play politics. The left gets power, and all they want to do is get more power. And that's an interesting thing to see, because when you look back in time, you can say, oh yeah, that's exactly what they do. And even now it's like, well, what are they doing? They're not really changing. They're consolidating their power. And, one of the other things he said was, when the right gains power, they look to do things. They look to change things. They actually look to like help people sometimes. And it's like, that's not what political power is all about. Political power is about getting tons of political power so that you don't have to even fight to get something done. It just gets done. And, that's, to me, learning that's like I don't care if you took if you have a political science degree, they didn't teach you that.
Yeah, exactly. One of the greatest things. I'm sorry, Sal. Did you want to go?
No, I was just going to say, I have a political science degree, and they didn't teach me that. So there you go.
Yeah, I got to say, Curtis Yarvin was so influential in sort of dumbing down the Machiavellians for me, in his way of, he'll always go back to the formal terms versus the real terms, which Burnham talks about. So when you hear them talking about how Trump is terrible, he is a nationalist. Nationalism, Hitler, fascism, racism, it's racism, and it's terrible and evil. By the way, how great is it that Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist? How great is it that Garibaldi is a nationalist? Bernie Sanders wants to fight for our nation, as does Ocasio-Cortez. It's like, how did you just do that total switch? Here I am chasing the logic of your argument. Meanwhile, you're over here laughing about me, the buffoon, chasing the logic of your argument when it had nothing to do with logic. It has to do with control or racism. Racism is terrible and evil, says the Democrats, the founder of the founding party of the Ku Klux Klan, who I'm still waiting for them to apologize, who today judge everything by race and by gender. So they not only have the history of it, today they do the same thing. If you understand that there's the formal terms, which is code for, I'm manipulating you, this is totally fake, this is to get morons to solidify me as being their ruler, well, then everything sort of falls into place, and you go, well, of course that makes sense. obviously. Sal, best contribution of Mencius Mulbug.
That was wasn't that the guy who came up with the term, Pete, you can correct me if I'm wrong, didn't he come up with the term cathedral? Wasn't he the
Yes.
first one to use that in like a political? Yeah, that has been super influential over the last, I don't even know, I guess maybe since he's been on your show, but that has been super influential. If you think about it, it's really accurate too, in the sense that you're not really supposed to criticize these people, because it's sort of like you're almost like criticizing like the clergy, right? It's like sort of sacrilegious, and that analogy sort of flows into other aspects of the political arena as well. Take a trip to the Lincoln Memorial, which is really a shrine, and you could see that it really is like an actual cathedral there. So that would probably be, I'd say, the most influential thing that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, final question. Thank you so much for your time. What is the most important thing you learned from the works of Michael Malice? Pete?
That the corporate press are the enemy of the people.
Totally.
100%. 100%. If there was anything, the first thing I would destroy in this country is not the government. I would destroy the press. I mean, 1917 style Petrograd, Bolshevik style dealing with the press. 100%.
Sal the Agorist, best contribution of Michael Malice.
P, I think we can have enough room in those camps for Congress and the Senate too. I'd probably say, honestly, with Malice, what it is for me is honestly, it goes we spoke about earlier in the first half of the show, is his mastery of logic is really fascinating, and the way he on social media to like he comes up with these this argument in a sentence that is just so mind blowing, and it's like how are they so concise and so like precise? So I would say just his mastery of logic and the way he uses it to promote the message of liberty to me has been super influential. And honestly, I've been trying to structure my tweets sort of the same way, right? If I can come up with something that's sort of logically consistent and sort of, it's some quick little quip that people are going to catch on to, that's a great way to spread the message. Those sorts of posts go viral very easily.
Exactly. All that, plus he's a great communicator for the ideology of anarchism. He calls himself one unapologetically, so people that like him can say, okay, so it's not a bunch of people throwing garbage cans into a Starbucks. There actually is a philosophy behind this. And he said that he's currently working on a collection of essays to introduce people to. So when they say, oh, how can I learn more about this? He can give them the Malice Handbook. I can't wait for that. My favorite thing is...
I have that book, Portraits of Anarchy. It's everything from left anarchists all the way up, and it's an amazing. It's kind of hard to find. I think I found it on Amazon used for like $20 or something like that. But I mean, it has every name in there you would expect to find, and it's all public domain. So he's talking about turning it into an audiobook, which would be amazing.
Unbelievable. So my favorite thing is, of course, his clear, concise definition of red pilling that finally makes sense and is productive. Red pilling is the belief that what is presented as fact by the corporate press is a carefully constructed narrative intentionally designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. Thank you so much to Sal the Agorist of saltheagorist.com. Thank you to Pete Quinones of freemanbeyondthewall.com. And thanks to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.